Hello, everyone. Welcome back to our journey through politics in Latin America and the Caribbean. This week, we'll be looking at transitions to democracy during the third wave, starting in the 1980s. To do that, we'll basically be defining what's the key terms of democracy and democratization. We're going to also talk about what were some of the preconditions that led to these democratic transitions across Latin America in the 80s, talk about what were some of the democratization dilemmas that were faced, and really look at what does democracy look like in Latin America today. So first off, what is democracy? Now, democracy is the most common definition of democracy is the procedural definition, of democracy, which is basically government by the people through elections. It is from the Greek democratia, which means, as I said, government run by the people of that country through elections and representation. However, there are actually three necessary features of democracy. The first is the rule of law, that dictates that constitutional elected officials are accountable to the people and that there is existence of constitutional, legal, and practical restraints on executive power by the presence of independent institutions such as the judiciary, parliament, and of institutions of horizontal accountability, and that it protects citizens from unjustified detention, exile, terror, torture, and undue interference in their personal lives. Then the next is inclusiveness, which is basically the right of every adult to participate in public activity. This includes the right to stand as even a candidate at elections. And the third is public contestation, which is the civic freedoms that allow citizens to exercise their preferences, criticize authority, organize opposition against the government, and dismiss it if the majority choose to do so. As a result, we know, therefore, given that it's more than just having elections, a democratic regime must ensure free, fair, and competitive elections under conditions that protect political rights and allow for civic freedoms. All in all, we just know that elections alone are not enough. Democracy also requires rights, participation, and legal equality. Now, what is democratization? Democratization is the means of moving towards a more democratic political institution, and it can come in different forms, where it is that you're moving from a fully authoritarian regime to a full democracy, as was the case of the USSR prior to Putin becoming president. It could be the transition from an authoritarian regime to a semi-democracy, which was the case of Mexico in the 1980s and 1990s, where the PRI had allowed for more electoral reforms, greater participation, that actually led to a more full democracy by the 2000s. And then the next is a transition from a semi-authoritarian regime to a full democracy, which is the case of South Africa after ending apartheid. Now, there are some key elements of democratization. These include institutionalized rule of law, a vibrant civil society, protection of minority rights, political tolerance and moderation, having an independent media, and civilian control over the police and the military. These are said to be what is needed to really consolidate democracy. And from what we understand, democratization is not always linear, smooth, or irreversible. Now, if we connect this back to what we learned about military regimes in Latin America and the Caribbean, we found that military regimes weaken many of these elements that make up democratization. So it made democratic consolidation harder during the 1980s and 1990s. And even today, if we want to go back, go even further. Now, Latin America have actually gone through three major waves of democratization. The first wave was from 1810 to 1920, which was a push for the independence movements across the region. The second wave was in the 1930s to 1960s as there was this populist expansion across the region. This was actually followed by the bureaucratic authoritarian rule that was largely maintained through military rule for a lot of countries or other types of authoritarian rule. And then the third wave was from the 1980s onwards, where we saw this re-democratization happening across the region. Now, what we found is that this third wave restored elections and ended many armed conflicts. But, however, it raised questions about the quality of democracy. This leads to the next question. Why did democratization happen in the 1980s? The first had to do with the economic crisis, which is said to be the most important factor. The military regimes that was in control between the 1960s and 80s faced a lot of issues. The first, they were faced with the debt crisis. There was hyperinflation. There was the decline of import substitution industrialization, the benefits that were coming from that. Then there was the IMF imposed structural adjustment programs to try to get them out of this debt problem. And they also saw rising unemployment and unrest. As a result, they found that military regimes lost legitimacy because they failed economically. So the key takeaway when we think about this is that authoritarian regimes tend to collapse largely due to economic failure, particularly if they are military authoritarian regimes. The second reason for why democratization occurred are basically geopolitical changes. It was now the end of the Cold War. Democracy was seen as the only route to take. The US is actually less willing to support dictatorships, given that they were no longer fighting against communism, so they weren't supporting any dictatorships in that way. And they saw there was a rise of human rights movements across the world and even in Latin America, that these changes helped to push for the call for democracy. So when you look at it, the global environment became more favorable towards democracy. The third has to do with the end of ideology. The Washington Consensus and neoliberalism shifted focus from ideology to economic reform. So you found that states prioritized stabilization over revolutionary politics. Fourth, there was what we would call political negotiation. We saw armed struggles declining, reformers accepted limited reforms, amnesty was actually granted to, in some cases, encourage authoritarian regime leaders to step down, and as a result, he found that transitions were often negotiated compromises, not revolutionary overthrows. So that's one of the first things that we kind of picked up. So with that, we saw four main types of transitions towards democracy across Latin America. There was the elite-led political transitions that tended to happen in the Southern Cone, the gradual liberalization from above, which occurred in Mexico and Colombia. As I said, in Mexico, the liberalization of electoral laws and other means of participation helped to usher in full democracy there. Then we had post-war and revolutionary transitions happening in Central America, and there was a regression crisis transitions that occurred in places like Peru, Ecuador, and Paraguay. Now, there are actually, when it comes to transition to democracy, there are two main theories or two main explanations that are provided for why countries would transition towards democracy. There's elite-based top-down explanation, and then there is the mass-based bottom-up explanation for why you may have seen transitions not just in Latin America, but also across much of the global south. So we're going to start off by talking about what was elite-based explanation for transition to democracy. Now, this is associated largely with Guillermo O'Donnell and Felipe Schmitter. And in their work that they wrote was the transitions of authoritarian rule in the 1980s. They basically argued that transitions begin within elite divisions, between the hardliners and the softliners, that change happens through negotiated pacts, and that the masses are often excluded from these transition discussions. They said when you look at the pacts that actually help in the transitions, they tended to focus on limiting policy choices, protecting elite interests, restricting outsider participation, because again, it's elite driven. They're trying to find a way to negotiate themselves out of power, but at the same time protect their own power in this situation. So that is what you tend to find. Now, it is found that this was really a good explanation largely for the transitions in Latin America, because we find that military that tended to be in charge, they didn't want to be in charge just to do so. They came into power to try to effect change to allow for stability. And if the situation is unstable, as we saw with a lot of the economic downturns that happened, you could see them making these pacts so that they could actually leave being in power, right? So this is what they say. So a lot of the arguments are that, this is really true for much of Latin America. It's the signing of these pacts and transitioning out of rules so that civilian government could take over. So what we see largely is that democratization in Latin America was largely elite driven, not mass driven. Now, another argument that falls under this discussion is Barbara Geddes' work, where she kind of says that, not all transitions are smooth, as it seems the case that Smith and Nadala kind of gave. And she said the kind of transition that happens tend to occur based on the type of regime that is being led, right? Is it going to be fast and volatile? Is it going to be a nice incremental change? It depends on the type of regime. And based on her study, she found that there's actually 4 types of regime that are out there. There's a personalist regime, where one has access to office and benefits from the office depending on the discretion of the individual leader. Then you have the military regime, where you have a group of officers that decide and rule and exercise and influence policy. Then you have the single party regime, like what you may find in Cuba, where political office and control over policy is dominated by one party, though other parties may exist to a lesser degree. And then you have the amalgam that mixes the 3 of those that we spoke about. Now, Geddes had noted that if it was that you had a personalist regime, transition to democracy tend to be low, and if it happened, it was going to be through a violent overthrow, which we saw in Argentina with Perón. Then if it was going to be a military regime, the transition to democracy tended to be very, very high, because they preferred to negotiate. As we said, the military prefers to negotiate themselves out of power. We saw this in Brazil, Argentina, and El Salvador in the second wave of democracy. Then we have this the single party regime, where the transition to democracy tends to be very low, and if there's anything that would lead to it, it would be based on mass pressure and negotiation. And we saw that with Mexico, and it was really a nice negotiated incremental change. And then we have the amalgam, that it depends on what the mixture is and how that transition would look. And then we had that with Chile under Pinochet in the 80s and 90s, because that was a mixture of personalist and military, and that also was done through negotiations. But again, it depends on the type. Now, the second argument that is provided, as I mentioned before, is a mass based explanation. Now, this theory argues that inequality would lead to protest, that protest would lead to a regime crisis, and that people are the main agents of change that will draw and move democracy, move towards democracy. However, what we found is that this argument is the model that fits better with Eastern Europe and Africa, more so than it did with Latin America. Because again, when you look at most of the transitions across Latin America towards democracy, elites initiated the process of democratization. If there's any mass protest or mass movement, it tended to happen towards the end of that negotiation process. Yes, it may have sped it up a little bit more, but the main movement was done among the elites. Now, as we talk about the dilemmas of democratization in Latin America, we know that Terry Lyle had argued that there is no single precondition that guarantees democracy. And most of the democracy theories that were out there, they failed to fully explain what led Latin America to transition, right? Because you had theories that talk about that wealth being the prerequisite, but we saw in some cases that this was not applicable in countries like Peru and Argentina. You had other theories that put forward that democratic culture had to be a prerequisite that could lead to this call for democracy or the fight for it. But we saw that this was not a precondition that stood in countries like Argentina, Brazil, and Uruguay. Other theories or explanations that have been used is that they said, national identity sequencing is something that is important in this democratization process. And when you look at it, this was not always the case, right? Because when you look at it, democratic regimes really was moving towards democracy, sometimes for human rights reasons, for the economic crisis. So this idea of national identity or problems with national identity didn't have an effect. A lot of the countries already had a very strong national identity, so there was no link there, right? And the fourth had to do with dependency theory, right? The dependency theory basically had this argument about, if we cut off ourselves from international markets, having more inward manufacturing, that this would lead to development. You needed, in some cases, have authoritarian rule to do this. But we saw in that case, once everything was stable, there was no move towards democracy, right? But we saw the rise or the decline of democracy was more in line with what was going on globally, right? What was the position of the United States across the region, as we knew they supported authoritarian regimes if it benefited them, right? What were some of the other market mechanisms and stuff that is happening globally in the global political economy? So while, yes, we found that on the ISI, the authoritarian rule, everything stabilized, so there was no need to move. But it has a lot to do with what's the global support, right? That may also have led to this democratization. So while there are these, what I mentioned, are good explanations for transition to democracy, they didn't always fit what we saw happening across Latin America, right? So we find that when you look at the region, despite recession, debt crisis, and even a weak identity formation, democracy still emerged, right? So we can only conclude based on this that democracy often occurs when strong elites compromise in Latin America, right? So again, all these explanations did not fit Latin America, right? Because all the things that would work against democratization, it still allowed democracy to emerge. So it's the elites and how it is that they negotiated and compromised seem to help the situation. Now, what about democracy in contemporary Latin America? We know that most countries are now fully formally, or most of them are, not formally democratic. However, public discontent remains high, impunity for past human rights abuses still persists, socioeconomic exclusion continues, and minority groups remain vulnerable. So right now in Latin America, we know, as in any place, democracy, or the quality of democracy, ebbs and flows. So it exists, but the quality is uneven. We can, when you think about it, big themes that should come out from looking at the democratization process and democracy in Latin America and the Caribbean today is that democracy or democratization was crisis-driven. Economic collapse actually weakened authoritarian regimes that ushered in democracy. We also know that democratization was elite negotiated. Transitions were pact-based, control, and often excluded the masses. Third, democracy remains incomplete. We know that procedural democracy exists, but structural inequality and post-authoritarian legacies still persist. One of the big takeaways that I'd like for you guys to understand about democracy in Latin America is the role that women play. We've seen the multiple female presidents across the region. We've seen how they've improved social services. They've improved many ways of life across Latin America. And even, we're seeing some of these countries under their rule improving economically. So I want you guys to, read a little bit more, look a little bit more on the role of women. We're seeing a growing number of them within the legislature and the executive, but women tend to be on the ground when it comes to movements and supporting candidates. They tend to be the ones that go out to promote and recruit persons in support of their preferred political leaders. So that's a big thing I want to know. Women are growing in number and influence in politics in Latin America and the Caribbean. So overall, one major takeaway that I'd like you guys to have is that we know that Latin America's third wave of democratization was less a triumph of mass revolution and more a negotiated elite response to economic collapse, geopolitical change, and regime fragmentation, producing democracies that are stable but often shallow. Thank you.